This is Yesterzine, the monthly magazine show about monthly magazines. We take a magazine from the golden age, play the games they like most and least, and flip through to find out what gaming was like when consoles had the prettiest games. Or did they? Because as we conclude the glorious month of December, we join PC Zone at the conclusion of the DOS era itself. It's November 1995 and issue 32. The PlayStation has just launched in the UK, bringing 3D to the masses. But PC Zone are here to prove the computer is still king. Were they right? Well, we'll find out. But there's still games to play. Our Gaming Heaven is a sports title that attempted to drag the PC into the PlayStation generation. Our Gaming Hell is a driver-licensed racing title, which is a tremendous sense of deja vu already. But we'll answer the question that plagued American racing fans for a generation. Unser or Andretti? But first, if you'll excuse me, I've got to put some implausible trousers on. The theme of this issue is the PC watching the emergence of the PlayStation, and this game fits. EA Sports PGA Tour 96 was generation straddling. There's the PC version here, which Zone thought enough of to give it 94%. There's obviously a PlayStation port as well, but there is also a 16-bit game on both the obvious machines. The history of golf games as a genre is pretty easy. There's basically 3 eras. Era 1 lasts until the late 80s, where people just chose what the bloody hell controls they wanted. Era 2 was the classic 3-click system, pioneered by Access's leaderboard in 1986, only just ahead of my first ever golf game. The still rather excellent, if simple, Mean 18 from later that year. And then there's the modern era, where someone thought flicking a controller stick or trying to move a mouse in a swing-like motion was a good idea, and they are idiots and I hate them. PGA Tour is firmly from the middle era, and wasn't the first PGA. The name is a dead giveaway. Not like there were 95 previous ones, of course, we're not going to make a lame joke of that nature. It was the first PlayStation one, but there had been 3 previous on Mega Drive and a smattering of various ones on PC. For instance, 96 had been immediately preceded by the PC exclusive PGA Tour 486, a concept title set around the invention of the game of golf, which of course occurred during the Iron Age, although golf as a rule set really developed during the subsequent Putter Age. Clubs too, of course, were much less sophisticated. I'd say I'm sorry, but you wouldn't believe me, would you? No, PGA Tour 486 was of course named after the CPU you required to run it, despite launching 2 years after the successor Pentium did. As the poster child for the dawn of CD gaming in golf, it had issues, and reviews panned it for a general clunky slowness. 96 followed, with a debut on the fancy new CD consoles and a farewell to the less fancy, less CD consoles. So the question we have to ask is an old golf game worth playing in 2021? How far have golf games come, and did they nail the 3D era first-ish time? And your first thought is that the EA Sports startup is absolutely doing the majority of the hype work here. Golf! I think we're seeing why the EA Sports big sub-brand never got a golf game, aren't we? The reviews criticised 96 for having fewer players and courses than some of the previous versions, but that's because the previous versions were just Mean 18 in its like, built out of slightly more detailed components. A child with MS Paint could literally have designed a course in those games, but here we're doing real life. They visited courses, they took photos, they designed in specific buildings with specific looks. This is essentially the visual transformation from early golf games to modern ones. PGA Tour 2021, now by a different publisher, looks very nice, but basically we're still the other side of the switch from painting courses like you're in Photoshop to recreating real courses with real course assets, a switch which basically occurs here. For fans of the real sport, this is a killer feature. As a racing aficionado, both virtual and real, I love Jeff Crammond's F1 game. It's the second time in 2 weeks it's been mentioned on the channel. But F1 GP basically builds its courses with generic components. Spool on just a couple of years to F1 on the PlayStation, since we're doing a lot of PlayStation for a PC episode anyway, and suddenly Silverstone looks like Silverstone. It's the place that you as teenage Dudley may well just have been at. And now with VR, which you can also do in golf games these days, you can really be there. So yeah, 96 has fewer things, but if one of those fewer things was your local course, or the course your favourite tournament had been held on, or your favourite golfist had won on, then it'd be quite the rush as we hurtled into the 3D and texture mapping generations. And speaking of those real golfers, while we only have 10 of them, here all those golfers had come into EA to be scanned and motion captured, so it's their swing and their outfits, and to a degree that was possible at the time, their face. And they've done a good job. All of the golfers here are in pretty pin-sharp resolution. Well, except this guy. And the next generation arrives in the gameplay too. The holes have lovely rendered flybys giving you an idea of what's to come, which is handy because I've not yet found an overhead map by which to aim. That's not the only thing that's a little hard to visualise too, because when we get to the green, the only guide to putting is the commentator. The commentary itself is quite slight actually, despite only 10 characters. The only time names appear to be mentioned is when they're introduced on the first tee in a manner that sounds horrifically cheesy and made up.
On the first tee, playing out of Naples, Florida, former U.S. Open and Masters champion with 6 amazing top 10 finishes in 1994, Fuzzy Zeller.
But I've been to golf fests and this is literally how they do it. There's basically one bloke that gets shipped around the world to talk bollocks 48 times a day. Nice life. It plays a perfectly reasonable game of golf though, especially if you turn down the difficulty a smidge, and actually for the time those digitised character models do look rather swish. And I'd suggest the holes themselves still do. Much like another game we'll see later, the mostly static nature of the scenery has really helped things here. And that's good, because you're going to be seeing a lot of it. If you start a tournament the way golf tournaments work, you're playing with 3 AI, and the game is going to make you watch them all take every single shot. It sort of makes sense, but by crikey is it tedious. You quickly realise the way round it is just to select a golfer for yourself and not the AI. The tournament carries on either way, but that isn't really how golf works. It cries out for either speeding up their go, or just the chance to see them waiting to walk to their ball while you're hitting your one or something. Playing it in 2021 is an interesting call. It's quicker than today's over-presented games, especially if you turn off stuff like that flyby and the 3 AI, but has most of the mod cons. If you're into golf, then obviously a lot of these players aren't going to be in more recent games, and we're actually in the year directly before a guy called Eldrick Woods joined the tour and made everyone call him something slightly less embarrassing instead. If you're not into golf as an actual sport, this is not your best game. Everybody's Golf or Mario Golf is, both of which fitting something of an RPG mechanic around their slightly sillier golfing gameplay. Call them the equivalent of Ridge Racer. But if you are a golf fan and you want the iRacing or Assetto Corsa golf game, then yeah, this is a good call. I tried PGA Tour 2021 when it was free on PS Plus, but there was so much around it in terms of 8 million club brands to unlock and overly lengthy career modes that I didn't even understand it, even knowing golf. This has most of the look of the thing, but you can start and get into a tournament pretty quick, and I like that. Certainly for the time, it was a good step forward for PC golf, and I can see why even the slightly laddish magazine like PC Zone awarded it a good score.
Energy.
Can we assume no one is going to argue that the big event of 1995 for gaming in the UK was Sony changing everything by launching the PlayStation? And the only reason it wasn't the biggest event of 1995 for everyone else is they already had the PlayStation, this being the era of massively staggered worldwide releases. This was a blow for the PC on the face of it. The Pentium era had given the PC a lead as the most technically advanced home gaming available, especially in the realm of 3D, and having the ability to actually make use of the storage possibilities of CDs. The PlayStation, and to a lesser degree Saturn, bursting on the scene meant the consoles were out to eat its lunch. There were warning shots ahead of this, of course. The Jaguar and 3DO had taken a tilt, but the Jag was hamstrung by a 16-bit CPU, and the 3DO launched costing barely less than a PC did, and never really recovered. Here the mainstream was discovering that 3D gaming, even beyond the capabilities of a PC, could be had for an expected £400.
$299.
Oh, sorry, my apologies, Mr. Sony. $299. PC Zone agree this month as they look at the PlayStation launch from their side. Their very first words are, "Nothing has given the video game industry as much of a kick up the backside as the Sony PlayStation." They also recognise the times they're living with in the PC too. Quite apart from the wider changes exemplified by Sony jamming the PlayStation into nightclubs, the PC was undergoing its own organic version of the same shift. There is a trend developing to haul it out of offices, off desktops and into a more consumer electronics role where it sits around controlling everything. Yeah, to a degree. Although lastly, the smart device probably took over more of this role. These days, that kind of thing would be your phone, tablet, or Alexa Hey Siri OK Google, rather than a desktop or even laptop PC as such. But certainly they became both more central to gaming and more of an everyone in the house device, especially here in 1995 as the competing computers became something of an irrelevance on that side until the iMac-led Apple comeback tour. For a magazine that could very easily PC fanboy their way through this, PC Zone are realistic, also pointing out the first in a trend that would be true for this and the next two console generations. That on release, the consoles were simply more capable machines than the PC, at least on the graphics side. This only really changed for the PlayStation 4 and 5 generation, where the lead consoles started becoming PCs in hardware terms. There were pluses too. The PC had historically been short of what you'd call top-level action games. Doom was a standout, partly because it's, well, Doom, but also that there wasn't a gigantic number of games trying to do the same thing. And seeing the other machines either fail to do Doom itself or resorting to desperate but worse clones would have warmed the heart of the PC gamer, if their machines heating the whole house by about 5 degrees wasn't doing that already. PC Zone are right though, the PC's record outside of that with action games wasn't great. We saw last year that the state of PC platformers in 1994 was stuff like Apogee's Hocus Pocus. Not a game I'd call crap like PC Zone do, but absolutely no comparison to even the 16-bit consoles, which were currently throwing around the likes of Sonic 3 and Donkey Kong Country. PC Zone point out the likes of Screamer, Fatal Racing, Actua Soccer and FX Fighter show the PC saw the PlayStation coming, but the promise is larger than that. For a hardware vendor, Sony was surprisingly forward in allowing their games off the PlayStation, and several of them were promised for the PC itself. Some even were to make competitor consoles like the Saturn. Concurrent development, especially between the PlayStation and PC, was reducing costs and unlocking sales and revenue, without yet unduly compromising each other. A whole slew of PlayStation games were due for near simultaneous release on DOS as the console launched, and PC Zone wants to tell you about 10 of them. Even PC Zone admit though, that the average PC wasn't quite up to Sony's Wonderbox of course. So how did those conversions do? Well, in the case of 3 of them, not well at all, in that the promised PC version never emerged. Notably, this includes the 2 headline acts of the PlayStation launch, which might have forced Sony's hand. PC Zone described the PC version of Ridge Racer as one of the industry's worst kept secrets, and a game that was almost finished. If it is, then that's a secret that's still being kept 27 years later, because it never was. The game was to run in slightly lower resolution and colour than the console one, and it's a shame we couldn't see it, because what it might also have done is use the raw CPU advantage of a PC to solve some of the draw distance issues of the PlayStation original. These were issues that plagued it so badly that, stunning or not, Namco took 2 more attempts to convert the original to PlayStation 1 before they were totally happy. Tekken was always more woolly. PC Zone accept themselves there's no official word, although they insist they know it's coming. It didn't, of course, which is a shame, and it took until 2015 and Tekken 7 to see an official PC release of a mainline Tekken title. Our third PlayStation no-show is predictable also. A Sony published title, Warhawk. If we have any Japanese in the room, then firstly, konnichiwa. Secondly, I'm sorry what I said about your mother. And thirdly, this was air assault in your country. I went into the game because I wasn't happy with the video quality in their own badly captured intro, and I'm so glad I did, because we're immediately into some of the best 90s CGI you can wish for.
Hatch, Walker, you've read the mission briefs? Creel's army keeps popping up all over the place. The last time they showed up, Strike Force Alpha went after them.
There wasn't enough of them left to fill a Boy Scout troop.
Creel's forces didn't even flinch.
The rest of Strike Force Omicron's already down there. Your mission's a little different.
For what it's worth, here's some of the actual game. It's a lovely little 3D flighty shooty game, kinda like a less realistic Ace Combat if you can even imagine such a thing. But we're PC people today and we never got it. But believe me, we are coming back here again soon. So we're 30% down, and we've still not even had a game to compare. We will get there, but unfortunately we first have to discount a fourth, because there's this, a platform game called Parasite, about a man called Jack who accidentally swallows a spacecraft. We've all done it. If I didn't know better, I'd suggest this was PC's own taking the piss. And the thing is, I kinda don't know better, because I have just been through 2 years of PlayStation release lists, and I'm 99% certain Parasite was never released. I'm only about half certain it ever existed in the first place. The official PlayStation Magazine's first issue, the magazine we opened the year with in the episode Afterthought Alley, was also published this month in a little callback I thought would just be for me to enjoy. But the point is, it doesn't mention it. They don't preview it. It's not on the release list. Just about every other game in this section is mentioned at least in some form, so I'm lost as to this one. 6 left then. And good news, they did all get PC and PlayStation releases, mostly from Sony-owned Psygnosis rather than Sony themselves. And we start in arbitrary order, with driving game Destruction Derby. It's not a bad start for PC, all told. At first these two versions look identical, and they certainly play basically the same. The first course doesn't show Destruction Derby at its full best, of course, and we have to remember that even with the drag factor of DOSBox, we're going to be playing all of these on what is essentially an ideal PC. All that said though, your PlayStation mates would not have much to crow about here. If we're picky and look closely, you can see where there were a couple of corners cut for PCs of the time. The position display above the start line has disappeared on the PC. And more noticeably, in terms of using computing power, the tricks the PlayStation had to get those screens showing the race to work would have required brute force on the mostly unaccelerated PCs of the time, and so those two screens are missing. If you really truly notice that while playing though, you're both picky and probably already on your roof. On fire. This isn't a big win for the PC though. While Zone correctly says action games weren't so common, driving games were always a thing, and 2 of their 4 examples of the PC's action renaissance were they. Granted, it was new for the PC to stand on its own rather than have the fallback of Amiga ports for this, but 1995 had seen Screamer, and reviewed this very issue, Fatal Racing. If we have any Americans in the room, then firstly, howdy y'all, secondly, I'm sorry what I said about your mother, and thirdly, this was Whiplash in your country. And also in this version I'm playing because I couldn't be bothered to go digging for my CD. It's relevant though. PC Zone gave Fatal Racing, which is actually by 90s driving game powerhouse Gremlin, 88%. And that was after deducting points both for understandably fearsome hardware requirements at the time, especially for this mode, which back then was considered high resolution, and to be fair was beyond most PS1 games, but also for the unaccountably high level of competition, which included Screamer and, they presumed, Ridge Racer. Assault Rigs is another Psygnosis game, and one considerably less well remembered these days, and granted, from a very quick playthrough, I can see why. In single player it's a very thin experience. Collect gems, avoid or kill enemies, find exit. The first few levels are simple and uninspired boxes, which is pretty needed for the tanks. That said, the controls are actually a lot closer to modern games than you'd think, with a perfectly functional strafe being especially suited to the PlayStation's control inputs. Technically, it's actually a win for the PC. In single player they look all but identical, with maybe slightly more muted colours on the PC, but it took me getting the captures side by side to even notice that. The PC one seemed awfully keen to tip me on my roof, but I strongly suspect that one was me. Where the PC can claim a victory is its support for 8 players if you could host a massive LAN party, whereas the PlayStation only manages 2, and even then they'll still be cabling machines together. Assault Rigs is probably an excellent multiplayer, but as a single player time has absolutely left it behind. Interestingly, it joins a few of these games in getting ports to the rival Sega Saturn console as well, despite Sony's ownership of Psygnosis. Virtually all of those ports were done by Perfect Entertainment, best known for the Discworld adventure games. Destruction Derby and this were two of theirs, although this waiting until 1997 meant it was a Japanese-only release for the Sega. But you're going to see a couple more by the time we're finished here. I know we're not actually reviewing these games. And I know we've already done 90s CGI acting is pretty ropey this episode. But I can't let Crazy Ivan past without showing you some of this intro. Because this intro...
Yes, Commander.
I've been cooped up in this sardine can for 7 hours now. I'm bored.
Our ETA at launch coordinates is...
That's close enough. Initialize launch procedure.
You can't do that, Commander.
Oh?
The transporter is not stabilized, the blast shields are not up.
That's enough. Launching now.
Hit the brakes.
If this is what average acting was like, everyone involved in Command & Conquer, which is almost exactly the same age, would be living in a house constructed entirely of Oscar statues. The female actor, who I'm guessing is not actually Russian, has a face about as straight as Alan Carr for this entire section, and that'll continue, because she'll be with you on the missions. You're watching the PlayStation version here, and as we start the game and I discover that despite falling out of a plane unharmed, White Ivan can't jump, there's nothing here that looks like it's beyond a PC at all. The draw distance is shorter than the half-life of Hydrogen 7, am I right, physics crew? And while there's a frame rate, it's not really drawing much in that draw distance. Just some sprite-based enemies and some voxel-like scenery that looks worse than that employed by PC games such as Comanche at least 2 years previously. 3 years earlier, in fact, because Crazy Ivan skipped DOS and was released for Windows late the next year alongside the Saturn version. So this should be a clear win for the PC. Better resolution, draw distance for days, and maybe a bit more detail on the... The crap is this? It's much, much worse. The draw distance is, if anything, shorter. The detail has gone. But worst of all, as soon as I get to any of the big bosses, they disappear into the fog in a way they didn't in the PlayStation version. My radar knows where they are long before I do. And if I thought I was navigating the terrain via map on the PlayStation version, it's 100% essential here because you cannot see a bloody thing. I don't think this is a loss for the PC's capabilities though, I just think this was a not especially great game that got an afterthought of a port. Broadly, you would think City of Lost Children would be a point back for PC. It's a point-and-click style adventure game based on the film, and that comes across immediately. It's a lovely looking thing from this PlayStation version intro. But while we're not here to review the game, I should warn you to not let that swing you. This game doesn't just go in for pixel hunting, but also stand in the exact right location hunting, and the puzzle solution described on the Wikipedia page involved putting a bone in a cash register to short out a security system, which borders on the bizarre. To its credit though, the game does warn me specifically.
Run, Donnelly!
Starting the game then, this is going to be a very short version comparison. The PC has this one signed, sealed and delivered. But that's not going to be a surprise to anyone. The PC version can run at 480p, a resolution the PlayStation hardware isn't even capable of, much less one most games actually used. And there's not going to be a frame rate issue because of the lack of action. There's also the distinct advantage that this game also didn't appear for another 18 months on PC for some reason, distancing it massively from the movie it's based on. Even if we didn't already know this is not an adventure game you want to play without a walkthrough, you also don't want to play it on either format. It doesn't use a mouse on either machine, this being a period where you must have full 3D control. And thus it's a slow, ponderous walkathon of a game using tank controls and static screens enforced by the pre-rendered backgrounds. Even this 5 minutes, as it struggles to play 2 speech samples in under a minute, and your character contemplates stares longer than a young kitten every time, is more than enough to make that point, even with a quite interesting plot I'm not going to go into. I might just hunt down the movie. That said, and this is personal, the low-resolution PlayStation version might be the prettier to me. The full 80p visuals on PC might be a better representation of what was originally designed, but showing the full detail of that just exposes the technical limitations of this. Your character looks even less like they're supposed to be in the scene. the detail just serving to separate them from the rendering. It's also, even if you turn the brightness down, just less grimy and real. But when you realise that on PC by this point LucasArts were releasing The Curse of Monkey Island, then it's really not good enough graphically. And neither, sadly, is the game. In terms of ongoing reputation though, we've saved the best for last. Wipeout is considered to be the game that made the PlayStation. When those In Nightclubs newsreels were made and posted, then it was almost always Wipeout they showed. With its designer's Republic-led aesthetic and an electronic soundtrack for the ages that YouTube is never going to let me showcase in a million years. And it's one of those things that's lost to history a bit, that not only did this get a PC version at about the same time, this is the last of our Saturn ones too, and there was even an N64 one when that system appeared. Wipeout got around more than your mum, but is somehow indelibly linked with the PlayStation launch in people's heads, and maybe that piece of marketing into public consciousness is one of the big secrets of how Sony came from nowhere to curb stomp. Was also the graphical lead for the system, alongside the two Namco arcade games presumably Sony blocked from release on PC in the end, and so probably represents the hardest job for the PC to match. And it doesn't. Quite. The first thing you'll notice is the PC version is a heck of a lot brighter, and maybe the darkness of the PlayStation version is hiding a few sins, but it also makes the PC one look a little cartoony, which is not the look we are going for here. But even with that, side by side, it's clear where the power of PlayStation was being employed. It's in slightly higher resolution to my eye, but it's certainly employing hardware graphic effects that the PC simply can't recreate entirely in software. There's lighting. There's anti-aliasing on the text, and minus the obvious pop-up every 3D game still had at this point, it's just technically more solid a world than PC. That said, this is all what PC's own admitted to right at the beginning of this. The PC wasn't yet quite the machine the PlayStation could be as a pure games machine, but the emergence of the PlayStation and a willingness for Sony to allow at least some of its gems across went a long way towards establishing the PC as a credible mainstream gaming platform, rather than just the thing you paid Championship Manager or Civilization on. It's a benefit the PC enjoys to this very day, especially now Microsoft are the other big console player rather than Sega. You just expect most console games to find their way to the PC. And it's not just from Microsoft either. In recent years Sony have rediscovered their PC mojo, dipping their toe in with indie games like Helldivers and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, before creating a dedicated publisher, PlayStation PC Inc., to bring previous exclusives Horizon Zero Dawn, Days Gone, God of War and Uncharted across. The PC2 was listening. The advantage some of these titles, notably Wipeout, had was dedicated 3D graphics hardware. It was coming for PC2. While cards like the S3 Verge and Power VR, technology later used in the Dreamcast, led the charge, it took the 3DFX Voodoo add-on cards, and later the single-card Nvidia GeForce solution, to catapult the PC past. And by halfway through the PS1's life, it was no longer even a comparison. The PC had a lead it has never really lost, especially now both main consoles use hardware adapted straight from it. And if you've been counting, you'll note we missed a game out. G-Police. This ended up getting very delayed, possibly because it shared a developer with Warhawk and didn't actually appear until 1997, when the world, especially on the PC side, had changed. Here's that PlayStation version. It's got a lowish draw distance still, sure, but look at that frame rate. It's got a rare thing of being a console title where you can make these decisions, but even in this mode, once I was playing it was perfectly fine and I could see what I needed to. It's also a very lovely large world, and the missions are varied and interesting. I couldn't actually get a PC version working in the end, but plenty of people have, and because it was into that PC era I just mentioned of 3D acceleration, you can continue to use those APIs to run it in quite astonishing resolutions, as high as 4K in this example. It's where the PC will always have a little advantage. Does your PC game not look pretty enough or not run fast enough? Just wait a few years. Still though, in 1995 the PlayStation probably won the battle. But ultimately it didn't so much win the war as just broker an amicable truce where the PC just traded arms to both sides of the console conflict. A few months ago we looked at Mario Andretti's Sega Mega Drive game, and I mentioned that some names transcend their sport into public consciousness. In America, Andretti is one such name. But if you ask the average American to name a second, it would be Unser. And the same dramatic law of diminishing returns applies. Al Sr., who died just this month, is the equal of Mario. Al Jr. won the Indy 500 twice. Al 3, yes, he was called that, was not great. You might know Al Jr. though. There was a NES game, a SNES game, and an unreleased Mega Drive game. But this, on PC, was his last, and the review in PC Zone, a grudging 60%, might well indicate why. But the game actually has quite the pedigree. It's badged as Mindscape Bordeaux, but that was the briefly held name of a developer called Kalisto, who made one of my all-time favourites, the excellent multi-character puzzle platformer Fury of the Furries, bizarrely released on the consoles as a Pac-Man game. In racing they did a few as well. I was quite fond of Ultimate Race Pro, despite the heavy expectation that came with being a racing game published by Microprose. But you also might remember the perfectly nice Dreamcast exclusive 4-Wheel Thunder. Which is to say, they knew how to make games, and driving games specifically. So despite being the kind of person who can reel off names like Ultimate Race Pro from memory, and having not heard of this, I'm not going into Al Unser Jr. Arcade Racing expecting a complete dud at all. Which is good, because this thing tried my patience immediately. Notwithstanding the December nature of this episode, Al Unser was unusual, because it's one of those rare, but about to be a heck of a lot less rare games that ran under Windows. In this case, both Windows 95 and Windows 3.1, which means it doesn't take advantage of DirectX since that didn't properly exist yet, but used Windows' old crappy built-in WinG libraries. All of which means it's an utter balls to get it running in 2021. It's one of those things about PC gaming that there's a bit of a trench at this point. Anything properly Direct3D you can usually convince to run in Windows 10. Anything DOS, and at this point DOSBox is perfectly happy with the situation, as you saw with all the games just now. And PGA Tour for that matter. But there's a period of early Windows games where Windows 10 panics. Especially as Al Unser insists that your Windows is set to 256 colours. Not less, but also, incredibly, not more. So we're running a virtual machine here. We've repurposed Serious Business application for Serious Business VirtualBox to run a PC within our PC. And frankly, as someone who played Pimp My Ride recently for a quid game, I'm struggling badly to get a lot of jokes about that out of my head. What does need to be explained to me is why a game made about an American sport in France features sponsorship from a British TV company that hadn't had a franchise for 2 years at this point. So let's try a race! Oh crap. I didn't even know there were Windows games that made this mistake. It was reasonably common in the early days for games to measure time by CPU cycles. A big offender is the third test drive game. Why anyone thought this was a good idea on a platform that was by its nature open, I have no idea, but they did. It's why DOSBox lets you choose the speed of the computer. But I didn't think anything this late would do that. Al Unser launched with the actually quite strict minimum requirement of a 4860X2, which would likely be at 66 MHz or so. Possibly because of how inefficient WinG is. But even then, the fastest PCs you could get would be 3 times that speed, so presumably this game played at wildly different speeds, and I immediately wonder if PC Zone might have been playing it on one far too in one direction or another. But that's okay. VirtualBox has a slider that can take it down to 1% of the host processor. Oh. So yeah, that's not going to work. PC Zone mention it's sensitive at high speed, but I think if it was this sensitive they might have noticed. What it isn't though, is pretty. In a world where PC DOS racing games could look like Grand Prix 2, and obviously the PlayStation was lending us Destruction Derby and Wipeout, this isn't good enough. Unfortunately we can't even cheat. The only other machine that even got this game was the Mac, and quite frankly if I can't get a Windows version running I'm not even going to attempt that. So the official Yesterzine conclusion as to whether you should play this game has to be no. Because even if it's the reincarnation of driving game Jesus, it can't possibly be worth this kind of hassle. Which is a shame, really. On the back page, why not enter the retrograde scene for videos on hardware, games, and well, hardware and games basically. But retrograde has a wide brief. We can talk about the impressive Codemasters J-cart that allowed 4 controller ports without the need to pay people money. We can talk about product placement in games. We can talk about modding a 2600 Junior to be marginally less dreadful. Or maybe just do a teardown of a quite literal Fisher-Price baby's first controller. It's all worth a browse, and if you're popping off to YouTube to sort that out, check you're still subscribed to this fine channel, and press some of the other buttons on the page too, and then come back here to claim your prize. I've just left it in the car.